Well, as the kids say, she lovelock my cave till I Si Teh Cah. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Nestled in the hills of Pershing County, Nevada, is a little town of about 2,000 people, and that town is called Lovelock. I wrote that intro a little over a year and a half ago when I first looked into the legend of a race of giant, red-haired cannibals said to live in the area surrounding the Humboldt Sink some 10 miles south of the modern town of Lovelock. Now, this story of a people called the Si Teh Cah first reached me through several short-form social media videos on various platforms, most of which gave a narrative filled with graphic details about 10 to 12 foot tall people who terrorized the tribes around them, kidnapping and eating them as their main source of food. And these people were said to be primitive, using weapons made of stone, speaking only in grunts and whoops, and living in caves in the ridges above what was, at the time, a large thriving lake. Now, I had originally made two videos on the topic, one primarily looking at the story itself and the history of the area, while the other looked into the archaeological and etymological evidence that should support or debunk the legend. But the problem is that I got some things wrong in those videos, and also they simply didn't need to be two separate videos. So, with a short week to produce this episode, and with some corrections to be made, I sat down to put this one together for you. And the reason I'm telling you this is that you, the viewer, fall into one of two camps. Either you haven't seen this video before, or you have. And if you haven't seen my stuff on the Lovelock Cave Si Teh Cah, then I hope you'll enjoy everything that you're about to see, all combined into one convenient episode. But for those of you who have, I wanted to be upfront and tell you that a lot of today's episode is going to contain content from the first two, as well as some from one of our Bigfoot episodes, and then all of that is interspersed with new commentary written specifically for this episode that includes entire pages of new script in some places. Things have also been rearranged to better explain the story, so even if you've seen some of this before, you definitely haven't seen it presented the way that you're about to. So, in classic Lore Lodge fashion, this video is actually going to begin with a history on the Numic peoples and specifically the Northern Paiute. But before we get into the historical background that provides the setting for this strange yet oddly plausible legend, I need to talk to you about today's sponsor, Raycon. You've probably seen us advertise for Raycon before, and if you have, there's a reason for that. It's because we think it's a good product and we think it's worth telling you about it. And the thing that we like best about Raycon is honestly the value that you get in this little package. You have 32-hour battery life on each of these little earbuds, very easy to put in, just a little slot, little twist, and they stay in super snug, which is awesome because they use active noise cancellation. So if you're the type that gets distracted easily, I am, this is a great way to make sure that you can maintain focus. If you're, I listen to a lot of soundtracks, a lot of modern classical music while I'm writing, so I've got that going, and then I don't have to worry about sounds from construction or the dogs barking or anything else breaking through that barrier. And of course, that 32-hour battery life means that I don't have to worry about recharging them throughout my day. I can just go. You can also do a good amount of personalization with the cases. They sell a whole bunch of these guys. I like this one. It's kind of like a marble thing. But like I said, really the best thing about Raycon is the value that you get here, because these guys start at just half the price as other premium brands with similar features. And I think it's awesome there's a product out there that allows you to get things like active noise cancellation and that extraordinarily long battery life at such a low price. That is a great value, and it's why we bring it to you. And on top of that, if you try Raycons and you decide that they're not for you, they do offer a 30-day happiness guarantee return policy, no questions asked. So if you'd like to give Raycon a try, you can go to buyraycon.com/lorelodge to get 20% off the best-selling everyday earbuds brought to you by Raycon. Lovelock is pretty unassuming today. It's the seat of Pershing County, and between 2010 and 2020, the population actually decreased by about 20%. The majority of the inhabitants work in either the mining or agricultural industries, and while whites are the largest racial demographic, Native Americans are the second largest at 7.14%. The town was established in 1866 when an Englishman by the name of George Lovelock arrived and bought the squatters' rights to about 320 acres of land around the Humboldt. In this case, when we say the Humboldt, there are a few things we could be referring to. Those are the river, the lake, and the sink. And I don't totally understand what a sink is, but to my limited knowledge, the way this works is that sometimes it's a lake or it used to be a lake. But the important ones here are Humboldt Lake and Humboldt River. Though there is an important sink, and that one is Carson. I did in fact learn what a sink is, and as it turns out, both the Humboldt and Carson sinks are important to this story. I probably should have explained that when this story took place, there was likely a lot more water in both. Interesting little fact about George Lovelock Sr., the man who settled Lovelock, Nevada, is that he was born in Wales to English parents, but all of his siblings seemed to yearn for adventure. One of his brothers moved to Australia, another to New Zealand, and of course Lovelock to California and then Nevada. The town began to experience growth for the first time in 1868 when Lovelock sold about 85 acres to the Central Pacific Railroad. This led to the town becoming a small but still important mining site. Lovelock himself, seeing exactly how profitable this entire venture could be, started investing in hotels, saloons, casinos, those kinds of things around town to entertain and attract more workers. More workers meant more mines meant more profits, and one such mine was in a little place called Lovelock Cave. And, they weren't looking for gold there, it was more bat guano, but you know what? Everything has its purpose. But while the cave may have an unassuming appearance, you may have heard the stories of the red-haired, man-eating giants that the Paiute once fought, known as the Si Teh Cah of Lovelock Cave, colloquially on the internet. According to the folktales you'll hear on the internet, the Giants of Lovelock Cave were anything from 9 to 15 feet tall. They were the scourge of these ancient Paiutes or ancient Native Americans, perhaps even predating them. They would terrorize the countryside, abduct people, trap them. It was just not really a good time to be a person around Lovelock Cave. As the legend goes, or at least the version of it you'll hear on TikTok or the Instagram reels, the natives eventually became so fed up with this giant menace that they drove them into a cave, threw all sorts of wood and brush into it, and then lit it on fire, shooting arrows at them anytime they tried to get out. And eventually, this was how they destroyed the last of these red-haired giants. This has been compared to all sorts of other legends, anything from the Wendigo, because it involves cannibalism, up through the Nephilim, because they're giants who seem to predate the presence of man in the area. But these stories obviously didn't originate on the internet recently, but they also don't come from the miners or from Lovelock. These are stories told by the Northern Paiute, and long before George Lovelock ever put down roots in Lovelock, Nevada, that territory belonged to a collection of Northern Paiute tribes. The Northern Paiute, of course, don't call themselves the Northern Paiute. They have all sorts of different, very specific band names, usually named after whatever the primary food or some sort of unique food eaten by that group is. As a general nation, they call themselves the Numu, or the people. These Northern Paiute are of course related to the broader Numic-speaking people group that inhabits the Great Basin area of the western United States. This includes groups like the Comanche, the Shoshone, the Ute, and the Southern Paiute. And of course, there are a number of other groups that still fit within this family. They primarily inhabited the dry deserts of California and Nevada, reaching up into eastern Oregon and western Idaho as well, and typically following animals from water source to water source as they hunted. This was a semi-nomadic group of people. The Northern Paiute were frequently involved in wars with other non-Numic speaking groups in the area, and these primarily included groups like the Pit River, the Klamath, and the Washoe. Relations with the Shoshone, relatives of the Paiute, were generally peaceful. The arrival of European Americans created an entirely new set of challenges for the Northern Paiute, including disease and competition for resources as the population of the region rapidly expanded. American settlers began knocking on the door of Paiute territory in the 1840s, and by the 1860s, it had reached a point where this was a pretty serious competition. And it became so intense that a series of wars broke out throughout the 1860s. Though the Paiute and the settlers had initially aligned themselves against the Pit River Indians, the alleged murder of a white man by a Paiute man threw all of that into turmoil. There had been an agreement between the settlers and the Paiute that any crime committed against either side would be punished. They would bring whoever did it to the authorities, and it would not matter. The Paiute would not protect Paiute, the whites would not protect whites. If you committed a crime, you were punished, that was it. Now, that agreement had been made by a chieftain named Numaga, and Numaga was generally in control of the situation, but there were breakaway groups, which included the Smoke Creek Paiute. They did not approve of these peaceable relations, they did not approve of Chieftain Numaga's leadership overall, and they decided they were going to agitate a little bit. This incident put Numaga in a difficult position. He could protect the Paiute man, who was a member of what was essentially a rebel cell. The natives, of course, didn't really think of it that way. But if he were to allow for one of his own to go and be handed over to people who were likely going to execute him, it would not look good within the tribe. However, if he didn't hand over the man for trial, then that could cause problems with the very, very powerful United States government. Numaga was an intelligent and well-educated man. He knew looking east that that entire land had once been peopled by his own. They may not have been Paiute just like him, but they certainly weren't the white man. He knew that to cross the United States was not something that typically ended well for the Indian. In the end, Numaga decided that he was unwilling to admit that a murder had occurred by one of his own, or deny that the murderer was one of his own, and he would not turn over the suspect. It's unclear precisely why he'd made this decision, but Numaga did go so far as to tell the settlers that he would not hand over any native who committed a crime or was accused of a crime. He would only hand them over to the authorities if the crime was committed against a Paiute. This violated the agreement, and both sides left that meeting knowing war was possible. Numaga gathered a council, as was the custom of the Paiute, and himself voted against war. By the Paiute custom, a unanimous decision was required by the War Council, and so they went into deliberation. During the debates, however, 2 Paiute children were reported missing, and allegedly, the white men were to blame. The story went that a young Paiute man had made a trade. He had given a horse to some settlers at Carson Station, and they had, of course, given him in turn a gun, but the gun didn't work. An argument ensued in which he was unhappy about being tricked into buying a bad gun. A dog bit him, the settlers laughed, and he got very upset. The boy returned to the tribe and told them about the deal gone wrong and that he had been cheated out of his horse, and added in the detail that during the argument, he had heard Paiute voices coming from the root cellar. And they were young Paiute voices. Having received information that the settlers had captured 2 of their own children, the deliberations were over. The Paiute were going to war. A raiding party rode to Williams Station, which was a stop along the Pony Express, and there they killed 5 people. 2 of those people were brothers of the William who owned the station, and the other 3 were just employees of the station, I believe 1 man and 2 women. And according to the Paiute version of this story, they did rescue 2 children. The settlers, on the other hand, claimed the entire thing was made up, there were no children, and this was just a reason for this level of reprisal against what was really not that big of a deal, even though it was wrong. Essentially, the argument was, you guys needed a reason to kill 5 people over a bad deal. We will likely never know if there were Paiute children in that root cellar, but what we do know is that the resulting series of conflicts saw the northern Paiute nation essentially destroyed. Defeated, the remaining Paiute were relegated to reservations at Pyramid Lake and Duck Valley. Westward expansion saw the end of the Paiute way of life, and most of them transitioned into more traditionally American styles of living. They took up careers in ranching, farming, entrepreneurship, and the like. But in the eras before the white man came, they faced an entirely different and yet still foreign threat. Sometime in the distant past, according to the Paiute, they were not the only people there. And a woman named Sarah Winnemucca wrote about the Paiute history and the Paiute in the time she lived around 1883. In her book, Life Among the Paiute, Sarah Winnemucca talked of a small tribe of barbarians that lived around her people. According to her, this band of barbarians lived along the Humboldt River. The exact time period for this conflict is uncertain. Winnemucca says that it was both many hundred years ago and that it occurred in the time of her 3rd or 5th great-grandfather. That could be anywhere from 150 to 300 years, and many hundred years ago is even more broad. It certainly did not happen during Sarah Winnemucca's time, nor did it happen during her father or her grandfather's time. Though both young Winnemucca, known as Badface, as well as old Winnemucca, were extremely important figures in Paiute history, neither of them recalled anything about being involved in this. If Winnemucca's dating of between her 3rd and 5th great-grandfathers is correct, then that would put this sometime in the late 1500s, anywhere into the 1600s. These barbarians are given no tribal name by Winnemucca, they're simply known as the barbarians. But it is clear that these are the Si Teh Cah, the giant red-haired cannibals who have been terrorizing the Paiute, or at least as we understand them in the modern version of things. Sarah's version's a little different, and we'll get to that name, Si Teh Cah, in a little bit. Don't worry. And these weren't just cannibals who lived somewhere off in the distance, and if you wandered into their hidden lair deep within the woods, you'd be a meal. No, these guys were coming down into Paiute territory and kidnapping Paiutes. They were laying traps along Paiute trails. They were even, according to her, digging up dead Paiutes to eat them. In fact, they were so bloodthirsty that according to Sarah Winnemucca, they would even eat their own dead. Now, occasionally there would be open war between Sarah's people and these barbarians, but it eventually all came to a head in one particular 3-year-long war. Now, throughout her story, Winnemucca uses the term my people to talk about the Paiute. But her specific people, her band, they were called the Koyidika. And I'm, again, trying so hard it might be Kwiwi. So as not to further offend any Paiute who might be watching, I'm just going to refer to them as the Fish Eaters, which is the English translation of the name. They lived by Pyramid Lake, about 45 miles to the west of Humboldt Lake, which is of course where we're talking about the Si Teh Cah. Sarah also tells us that before this war occurred, they had tried to actually bring in some of these barbarians and rehabilitate them, make it so that they could live the Paiute way of life and not the eating people way. But according to her, all of this failed. And when we look at a lot of Native American tribes and stories, we do tend to see a trend that cannibalism is sort of seen as this uncurable taboo. If you commit the act of cannibalism, then you will forever be a cannibal. You're not reformable. Obviously, in this case, they thought maybe we can reform some of them, and then you have other situations like the Wet'suwet'en, the Wendigo, where there is no fixing it. It seems that, in this case, taking some of them in and trying to prevent them from eating people only to have them do it anyway was kind of the point at which they said, there's no curing this. And according to Winnemucca, these were incredibly agile and brave warriors. She recounts how the Paiute would fire volleys of arrows at them, and they would simply jump into the air, grab the arrows, and shoot them right back. Just to quickly interject here, I do have to wonder if this might hint at the story being older than I initially believed, because the Paiute certainly were using bows by Sarah Winnemucca's time, and they had been for centuries. However, one weapon that predated the bow, and which has been found in the region, in fact I think they found one in the cave itself, is the atlal, which is a simple device that allows the user to throw a spear, javelin, or dart with greater power or accuracy. Well, power and accuracy. All of these projectiles are larger and slower moving than arrows, which would make them easier to grab out of the air. So this demystifies the barbarians a bit, but it could tell us something about how old this story really is, if it turns out that that's what they were actually using. At the start of the war, it said that there were 2,600 of the barbarians, whereas the number of Paiute isn't given. Considering the much greater size of the Paiute nation, it's possible there were a lot more, but this may have been a localized band-to-band conflict as well. Over the course of 3 years, the Paiute whittled this population down to a fraction of its former number, and the few survivors went to hide on Humboldt Lake. And I mean on. They built rafts out of tulle, which is a type of cattail, and they sailed out into the lake. But they didn't have enough provisions to be on the water, and they were surrounded by Paiutes, who every time any of the Si Teh Cah would try to land, the Paiutes would shoot them. One night, they were able to land on the eastern edge of the lake, get everybody off, and go hide up in a cave. The Paiute weren't able to stop them getting out of the lake, but they were able to track them to their final location. The Paiute were relentless, firing arrow after arrow every single time somebody tried to leave the cave. If they went for water, they figured this was the only way out because people kept trying to come out that entrance. And periodically, they would yell out to the barbarians and say, hey, if you guys just give up eating people, we'll be fine. We can be chill. We'll let you live. And according to them, they just didn't respond. The barbarians said nothing back, and they figured this was either them being defiant or they were so deep inside the cave that they couldn't hear them. But in Winnemucca's account, she does suggest that these people were basically choosing cannibalism over life. But here we get a very important and interesting piece of information about the things we're dealing with. While they're typically presented as giant cannibals, inhuman monsters with the complexion of an Irishman, here we're told that they speak the Paiute tongue. And alongside this, she mentions none of the other supernatural characteristics. According to her, these are just barbarians who eat people, and they speak Paiute. Now, they've lived amongst the Paiute for a long time, as she said. It seems perfectly reasonable that being a small minority within a much larger majority nation, you would learn the lingua franca. The fact that these barbarians are capable of speaking a human language and are not described with any other supernatural characteristics implies that what we're dealing with here is not the valiant slaying of supernatural evil creatures and monsters, but genocide. Because receiving no answer and assuming that these people are irredeemable, they set fire to the cave. They pile wood inside of it. They actually pile it at the entrance to like form a barricade, but according to them, the Si Teh Cah just keep pulling the wood inside, and then so they just light it on fire to smoke them out, but instead they all die. Or at least it's believed that they all died, because when the Paiute went back to check and see if anybody was still in the cave or had come out, it was still smoldering and there was a horrific stench that they assumed must be dead bodies. Thereafter, they were called Si Teh Cah by their neighbors, which, according to Sarah, means enemy or conqueror. Interestingly enough, this story is not too dissimilar from a Yosemite story. We talked about that one in our Stacey Aris video, but essentially, the Yosemite were known as they are killers by their neighbors. They claimed it's because they killed grizzly bears. Their neighbors had other ideas. This could be a case of the Paiute being called the conquerors by their neighbors, not because they defeated the evil cannibal giants, but because they were a warlike and invasive people. Which, if you ask the Pitt River, the Klamath, and the Washoe, you'll probably hear that, yeah, the northern Paiute were a rather warlike people. There's a little bit more on that coming later, but we'll get there. Now, if Sarah Winnemucca were the only person to recount this story, you might just roll your eyes and say, okay, well, this is just fantastical. But Sarah Winnemucca is not the only person to recount this story, and also I do apologize for pronouncing it Winnemucca all that time. I fixed it. I got better. I'm doing my best. Anyway, it does appear that she may have been the first to tell this story in a publicly available written form. You see, back in 1912, the University of California got wind of an excavation opportunity in Lovelock Cave. And several years earlier, a pair of miners named David Pugh and James Hart had purchased the mining rights to what was at the time nothing but a guano-filled bat cave. Now, they knew this, and in fact, it was the very reason they purchased it, since guano was a valuable ingredient in things like fertilizer and gunpowder. And at first, that's all they found, layers and layers of guano. But as they brought more and more out from the upper layers of the cave and began to run it through a sieve, they found a lot more than the rocks and debris that they had been expecting. Mixed in with the various naturally occurring materials were a number of Native American artifacts, which the miners immediately recognized could be a source of income in their own right. They decided to keep the complete or more valuable looking pieces, discarding anything that was either too broken or too damaged to bring a good price as they continued to dig deeper and deeper into the cave. And it was about 20 feet in that they came to perhaps the most intriguing discovery of them all. It was a mummified body of a 6-foot 6-inch tall man, and it wasn't the only mummified body in the cave, with 4 or 5 smaller female skeletons located very close by. The male had been bound in ropes from his ankles up to his knees, and a grass rope approximately 8 feet long was tied around his neck and knotted behind the ear. And in addition to all of this, his body was mummified, but with the exception of the abdomen, and it's unclear exactly why. Maybe that was part of the embalming process, but it's hard to say. But interestingly enough, all of the remains had distinctively red hair, and the women were wearing tall moccasins, with 2 or 3 dressed in buckskin robes or coats of some kind. Now, the more that they dug, the more Pugh and Hart found, and eventually it came to a point where the cave's contents appeared to be comprised more of artifacts than of bat waste. Realizing they probably stood to make more money by selling the man-made materials than they would by selling whatever further guano they could dig out, they contacted the Smithsonian, which, being a government-run entity and therefore utterly incompetent, declined to purchase the items. It wasn't that they weren't interested, but rather that they didn't want to pay for them, and as a result, Hart and Pugh looked for other buyers. And most of the materials, as a result, were purchased by private collectors, and there are rumors of skeletons being sold to fraternal organizations for mysterious rituals. But museum curators did manage to get their hands on a few select items. Word eventually did make it to the University of California, where it reached the ears of Professor Alfred Kreber, one of the United States' early anthropologists, and a big name in the fields of anthropology and archaeology. Kreber immediately recognized the value of the discovery and sought to gain excavation rights both in order to preserve the site and to bring some glory to his department. The problem was that his department had no one available to go and perform the dig, and if he failed to get things started immediately, there was a chance that another school might swoop in. He needed to act quickly, and after he probably considered options like sending a graduate student, an assistant, perhaps even an undergraduate archaeologist, he found his solution: a museum security guard by the name of Llewellyn L. Loud. Now, Loud had no formal training, but he was an intelligent man, so he was given a crash course in archaeological excavation, some instructions about record keeping, and then he was sent off to Nevada. And for the next 4 months, Ben Stiller's character from Night at the Museum performed a rudimentary dig, and while it was on the rough side and not particularly in line with archaeological guidelines, he managed to produce enough rough but usable data to begin forming a general idea of what was going on at this cave. What he was not able to do, however, was write a proper archaeological report on his findings. So for 12 years, from 1912 to 1924, Loud's notes sat in the archaeology department at the University of California, until finally the university managed to assign an actual archaeologist to the project, a man by the name of Mark Harrington. With Harrington in tow, Loud returned to Lovelock to continue the work, and part of that process was the collection of oral accounts regarding the cave from those who lived in the area. And one such account was passed along by mining engineer John T. Reed, who received his version from a very good source, Sarah Winnemucca's brother, Captain Natchez. In Reed's account, he tells that Natchez told them of the great calamity which had occurred in that cave to another race of people who had been exterminated by the Paiutes. So we're told off the bat that this is another race. So the Paiute might simply be saying that these aren't Paiute, they might be saying these aren't Numic, they might also be saying these aren't Indians. And just to clarify, in the source material, they do use the term Indians, and even the Native Americans are doing this when it applies to everybody from the North American continent. If they're talking about a specific nation, they say the nation name. If they're talking about a specific tribe, tribal name, specific band, band name. It just really depends on how generalized they're trying to be. According to him, 4 or 5 generations back, the Paiute fought this great war against a group of strange Indians. He says that this was a race of people with red hair all over their bodies. He said that this race of red-haired people also spoke the Northern Paiute language, and that it was they wiped them out. No reason for the conflict was given by Natchez, but Reed surmised that it probably wasn't cannibalism, as Sarah had claimed, because that wasn't compatible with the idea of trying to bring them into your own home. And on the other hand, Reed was not much of an ethnologist, he was a mining engineer, so he might have simply not understood the dynamics of Native American tribes. He had heard another account from a woman named Annie Lowry, who was half Native, half white, and she said that it was a battle over resources, but genocidal conflict over stealing some rice and kidnapping a couple of women seems a little bit of a stretch. As for Reed, his best guess was that this was an issue of scarcity, that the Paiute needed food, and the cannibals needed food, may not have even been cannibals, might have just been another tribe of Native Americans, and the Paiute decided to just wipe them out, and this is a legend that arose to explain that. Unfortunately, for most of Reed's story, it's just limited versions of Winnemucca's story, but there are some new details added. Natchez said that the Si Teh Cah came to Lovelock Cave from the southwest after some fighting along the Carson River. Now, this is a little difficult because the Carson River isn't southwest of Humboldt Lake for a long while, but it is southeast of Humboldt Lake, as is Carson Sink. Apparently, it didn't occur to past me that the Carson River might have had a different course when this story took place, or that the ridge between Humboldt and Carson Sinks extends southwest of the former. Either one would explain how the Si Teh Cah approached the Lovelock Cave area from the southwest, so good job, 2023 me. He says that this group of people had been driven northwards by fighting other Paiute further south and eventually just reached their end at Lovelock. Reed has heard a number of different accounts here, and he comes to the conclusion, based on all he heard, that whoever the Paiute were fighting here had probably been there since before them. So as we can see with this story, even down to simple details like where did these people come from are very murky. Natchez further explained that after driving them into the cave, his people piled sagebrush at the entrance, they would pull it into the cave, they would pile more sagebrush, and then eventually they lit it on fire and smoked everybody out. Any who attempt to escape were shot with arrows. These details about people actually managing to escape, as well as where they may have come from, are not present in Winnemucca's account. And then a few more renditions can be found. One of them I got from the Lovelock Paiute tribe. The Lovelock Paiute tribe is a colony of descendants who live in the town of Lovelock in what is technically, I believe, its own municipality. It consists of 3 streets and a little over 24 houses, as well as a tribal administration building. The people who live within this colony consider themselves the descendants of the Paiute who lived in Lovelock up until white settlement, and then returned. Among stories about how George Lovelock Sr. was very kind to the natives, and they were all very good friends, he would feed the native children fruit, and how the people lived back then and all of that, they tell a story about this weird little thing that happened. This is something that happened in a time before the white settlement, settlers to the Paiute, who call themselves Numu, and it was wrought upon them by strange Indians. It says that the Paiute of Lovelock were called the Te Cah, or the ground squirrel eaters. They were related to the Kwi-Wi of Pyramid Lake, the people of Sarah-Winnemucca, but they were not related to the strange Indians, to whom they referred as Numa Te Cah. Now, as I mentioned, the way many Paiute band names worked was that you had what they eat, and they are that eaters. Coop, ground squirrel, Te Cah, ground squirrel eater. Kwi-Wi Te Cah, fish eater. Numa Te Cah, man-eater. And these Numa Te Cah, the man-eaters, are described as being tall with red hair covering their entire bodies. Now, that could just mean that they had thicker arm hair and body hair than the natives themselves. We could also be looking at something really hairy in the sense that Europeans tend to think of it like Bigfoot. According to the Lovelock Paiute, it was these Coop Te Cah who fought off the Si Teh Cah, the cannibals. But this detail is excluded by Winnemucca. There may be an explanation for that, however, because Winnemucca's father was a chief. According to her, in Life Among the Paiutes, she describes him as being the head chief of the Paiute. Some historians have argued that this was a position where he was the head chief, he was in charge of all the northern Paiute, but others have suggested that it was more of a first among equals position, like the Pope before the schism. Either way, he would have been a very influential man in the Pyramid Lake region. So it may be that Winnemucca wasn't suggesting that it was her people specifically, the Kwi-Wi, but rather that it was all her people, the Paiute. Aside from the tribal name details differing between the account from the Paiute Lovelock tribe as well as the Winnemucca account, there's basically the same story after that point. The Coop Te Cah chase them off the lake, they chase them up into the cave, they stack wood, they burn the wood, and that's the end of it. So when you look at the Native American version of events, and we take a step back from the fun internet stuff that we love to talk about, and we look at what do the Native Americans actually say about the Si Teh Cah. Let's start with giants. They're described as tall, yes, but not necessarily as giant, and it seems like much of the whole thing with giants may have come from the finding of that 6 foot 6 inch tall mummy. Now, 6 feet 6 inches tall is a very tall person. It is an especially tall person anywhere beyond 200 years ago, but it's not an extraordinarily large person. If you're going to use the term giant to mean something supernatural, to mean anything beyond like, wow, that's a giant watermelon, you're gonna need to be pretty specific here. We can't be talking about people who are within the normal range of human height. To call something a tribe of giants, you're gonna need more than one guy who looks like he probably could have started in the Italian league. One Division II basketball player does not a giant race make. And neither Winnemucca nor Natchez described these things as being gigantic. Nor do Reed or Loud or Harrington or any of the people who were studying this, as well as the people who have done it more recently, they don't really come across any versions of it. They never say giant. They might talk about the exact size of a body, but you don't have them throwing that word around. The one account that I did find that called them giants from a Native American source didn't even call them giants, it called them tall. The red hair aspect I find to be one of the more interesting. Now, of course, as mummification occurs, the hair does tend to turn red, but it's not that Sarah Winnemucca saw the red-haired mummy and then said that these people had red hair. It was that she said these people had red hair and then they found the mummy. There's also the fact that they were described as being hairy all over their bodies. Compared with Europeans, people of Native American ancestry typically have less body hair. So to say that they were hairy all over, to us, like I said, might come across as, thinking like gorilla. But to them, it might be more like hairy people. Just, if you've seen an Italian, lots of hair. Someone who had chest hair and long arm hair and thick leg hair and facial hair is going to be hairy all over to a group of people who typically do not have much body hair. Now, I find the issue of the red hair to be particularly interesting. If you're a Native American who lives amongst people who typically have very little body hair, and you see people with even the normal amount of body hair for a European, you might refer to that person as being hairy all over. This is not to say that we're talking about these people being Europeans. They're not described as being particularly pale-skinned, but it could imply that we are dealing with a different ethnic group. And if there is a different ethnic group, that opens up a lot of questions. As for the cannibalism aspect, there's not a ton of physical archaeological evidence for it. And you have to factor in that cannibalism is one of those things that around the world is typically viewed as being just absolutely horrific. You see accounts of the Romans calling people cannibals, the Greeks calling people cannibals, the Americans calling the natives cannibals. There's a lot of circumstances where when you've got one group of people who are typically, in in the traditional sense civilized, when they encounter people who are, to them, barbarians, a lot of the time those barbarians happen to be cannibals, and it's not always certain that they really were. In some cases, we do in fact find archaeological evidence that supports the idea that there was ritual or frequent cannibalism. In other circumstances, we find nothing of the sort, and it seems unlikely. Given the near complete lack of archaeological remains from this group of people, it's really difficult to say if they really were a cannibalistic tribe. And that's the thing, you can't really get where you need to go with this story without really looking into the details and seeing how all of it connects at the most granular level. Looking at the broad strokes, it's easy to look at this and say, well, it probably didn't happen. It's just a folktale about a battle that over time, snowballed and whispered down the lane, became more and more exaggerated and interesting and fantastical, and what was originally probably a minor tribal conflict over resources became an epic struggle against cannibals. And that's precisely what the first archaeologists to work on this topic, Mark Harrington and Llewellyn Loud, concluded. But there are reasons to believe that the truth may not be so simple. Since the completion of the Loud-Harrington report in 1929, archaeologists have generally considered the legend of the Si Teh Cah to be something of a myth. If the story happened at all, many argue, then it most likely didn't involve giants, red hair, or even cannibals. But the evidence suggests something a little bit more complicated than that. It's not just that there's an oral tradition with absolutely zero evidence that it ever happened. It's that there's an oral tradition that raises a whole bunch of questions that have yet to be answered, but for which answers could very feasibly exist. There's a lot to unpack, but it's probably best to start with Llewellyn L. Loud's 1924 report. Now, the excavation itself was in 1924, the report came out in 1929, and of course, Loud's original excavation was in 1912. In 1912, the way he set it up was that he went into the cave, he dug around a bit, he called these lots, the area that he dug in, and he ascribed different artifacts to what lot he found them in. But he didn't record vertical depth, so it was hard to say how old anything was, and this is all before radiocarbon dating. The 1924 excavation came to some conclusions that I'm not totally sure are valid. In Loud's report, he writes that these cannibals are kind of everything the Paiute were just not familiar with. They used spears but no arrows. They ate people, not animals, and they dressed in robes made of skins and feathers. Now, this is coming from a summary section, and because Loud was not a trained academic, he was a museum security guard, his sourcing is not, his citations aren't ideal. Where a trained archaeologist would put endnotes or footnotes, Loud just doesn't do that. He does talk about everything, but it just isn't organized properly. As a result, it's kind of difficult to take him at face value when he just says stuff, because it's not, hey, here's this thing, and here's how I know that in the notes. It's, here's this thing, and if you've read the entire document, you've probably understood his reasoning, but it's not exact. He also takes the angle that Winnemucca's story about what happened at Lovelock Cave is probably just the Paiute trying to rationalize the period before they existed. To give you his exact quote, he writes that these traditions should be regarded as an attempt to explain the archaeological remains of an earlier cultural period. He does say that a remnant of these ancient cannibals supposedly still lived among the Pitt River, but I'm not sure where he got that. Just as a quick aside, I think I may have figured out where he got that, but it's going to come up later in the video. The Pitt River tribe includes 11 bands in Northern California. You can sort of think of bands as something akin to a clan, where it's a group of related families that all tend to, in this case, marry outside of the band, take wives and husbands from other bands. Usually a number of bands make up a tribe, a number of tribes make up a nation. The 11 bands of the Pitt River used to have their own dialect each of an ancient Pitt River language, but now only a couple of those language dialects have survived. But what's important here is that it's not a Numic language. It is not related to the language spoken by the Northern Paiute. But according to Loud, both the Pitt River and the cannibal people are described or named as Si by the Northern Paiute. But like I said, we need to be cautious about Loud's understanding of the stories he was being told. There are some occasions where he makes these simple yet really significant errors. One such example occurs in regard to Sarah Winnemucca's story, and the part where she says that after they defeated these cannibals, they were referred to as Si Teh Cah by their neighbors, a name that she says means conquerors, or can also mean enemy. Now, that's a kind of story that we've heard before, and it does open some questions about whether or not getting this story from the Northern Paiute is the most reliable way to get an accurate account of events, but the thing is it might be the only way to get an account of events. I bring that up because we've talked about the Yosemite, whose name means they are killers, and according to the Yosemite, that's because they were killers of grizzly bears, but according to the people around the Yosemite, it might not be because they were killing grizzly bears. By the same token, Si Teh Cah may well mean conqueror or enemy, but it might not mean that because of them killing the cannibals. They might have just been an aggressive nation, which the Northern Paiute, compared to some of their neighbors, were. They were typically invading the Washoe, the Klamath, and the Pitt River. But it seems that Loud mistakenly thought that she was referring to the cannibals as Si Teh Cah, because he goes on to say that that's probably not what that means. He doesn't offer an alternative, but that it might be coming from somewhere else. Essentially, what he says is that because he has heard of the cannibals referred to as Si Teh Cah or Si Teh Cah, something like that, and he's also heard the Pitt River referred to as that Si Teh Cah is probably just her mistranslating Si Teh Cah. Now, of course, what Winnemucca is actually saying is, we're Si Teh Cah, they're Si Teh Cah. It's also possible that Loud might have just been saying Sarah got the mistranslation of Si Teh Cah wrong, and that it just doesn't mean conqueror or enemy. But in the next sentence, he says that he's also heard the term Si Teh Cah, which was what it seems he thinks that she got wrong. Basically, he thought that she thought Si Teh Cah was the term for the cannibals, and she just had it wrong. No, she was saying Si Teh Cah is us. They're the cannibals. They're the barbarians. And this is another issue with Loud's work. He claims that this term Si Teh Cah applied to the Pitt River Indians, the Eastern Oregon Indians, and the cannibals. But this really does not seem to be the case. So far as I can tell, Si Teh Cah does not mean tool eaters, and it kind of can't. Tool is translated as some dialectical variation of toy. It also might be to'i. I don't know Native American languages really well, but it's T-O-I. And I'll admit, this is a hard thing to figure out because there are not a lot of resources available online for the Northern Paiute language. There is a dictionary, but it's $100 and it wasn't going to get here in time. And then there's an online Northern Paiute dictionary with 4 of the dialects, but not all of them are really fleshed out. Only one of them had a word for tool in it. It was not say or say-e or sai-e, but the Bridgewater dialect did have a sai-e. Now that is spelled S-A-I'. And in their dialect, that word, sai-e, means thigh. In my opinion, Si Teh Cah or Si Cah or Si Teh Cah makes a lot more sense when the term is thigh eaters and you're describing cannibals. Additionally, there is also a currently existing tribe of Northern Paiute, or band of Northern Paiute, known as the Tool Eaters. Initially, they came from the Carson Sink area, which is just a few miles southeast of Humboldt Lake. That association of Tool Eaters from Carson Sink with the People Eaters of Humboldt Lake could explain the confusion that Loud was experiencing here. As for Eastern Oregon, I don't see any evidence that the Paiute there used the term Si Teh Cah at all for themselves. I also couldn't find any examples of it being used for any of their regional enemies. And the Pitt River both live entirely in the opposite direction of where all of this was supposed to have happened, and don't seem to use that name or have that name applied to them. Also, it wouldn't make sense with the Paiute naming conventions. They would tend to name tribes and bands after what their primary dietary facet was, which is why the cannibals are called Numa Te Cah. The Pitt River, on the other hand, are known for eating deer, and they're called the Pitt River because they used to put pits by the river to catch deer. Another odd moment from Loud here is regarding his geographical notes, because he says that another band, another tribe of these cannibals, which he refers to simply as others, lived on an island in Pyramid Lake and called themselves the Fish Eaters. That's a problem because Winnemucca's people are the Fish Eaters, the Kwi-Wi Te Cah, and they're not the cannibals. This leads me to believe that Loud simply didn't understand the stories he was hearing, or that he misrecorded them. Now here's the part where I tell you how I messed up on this one the first time around. In Loud's report, he concludes that Si Teh Cah means tule eaters, and because it just means tule eaters, it could simply apply to anybody who eats tule cattails. And I had said this wasn't possible in the Northern Paiute language, but it would appear that I missed something. When I first looked at this story, I couldn't find an example in any of the dictionaries of a word similar to say or sai or something along those lines that meant tule. So it seemed logical to argue that they wouldn't have been tule eaters because there was no sai word for tule. However, deeper in Loud's work, He wrote that Gilbert Neches, a nephew of Sarah Winnemucca, gave him the names of a few plants, and the word he gave for tule was in fact say or sigh. On the other hand, I've been unable to corroborate that in any dictionaries, whereas I did find a dictionary which translated sigh as thigh. This leaves us with two options that have very different implications depending on which one is correct. If it is thigh, and then these do sound like they could be cannibals. After all, there is another band called the Tule Eaters, and in the northern Paiute, they are called the Te Cah. The same issue arises if we try to say that Si Teh Cah is derived from thigh eaters, however, since the only term the Paiute ever apply to these people themselves is Numa Te Cah, which of course directly translates to man-eaters. So which is it? Oddly enough, the simplest explanation may be that Si Teh Cah is not derived either from Tule Eater or man-eater in any way, and was in fact a completely different term for a completely different group of people that somehow got mixed into the bag during Loud and Harrington's research. So where exactly did Si Teh Cah come from? We know that it seems to derive from Se Cah, but that word in and of itself is really hard to define. And somewhat painfully, the 1906 edition of the Handbook of American Indians does identify a tribe in eastern Oregon as the Se Cah, and that tribe is the Yahushkin Paiute. You can see how this is quickly becoming an issue. Yet, frustrating as that may seem, it could actually be a clue to the origin of the association between the Si Teh Cah, the Numa Te Cah of Lovelock Cave, and that Pitt River tribe mentioned by Loud, because certain parts of the northern Paiute mythology do tell about a time when cannibals roamed, one of which was particularly feared, and he was called Numuzoho. Numuzoho was known to grind up his victims, who were frequently fully grown human beings, in a giant mortar and pestle, and of course his name means people pounder. In addition to this, it's said that he was a big man, though no particular size is given. It's just said that he was, bigger than us. It also isn't particularly clear from the various stories that I was able to dig up whether or not Numuzoho is a particular cannibal or the name for the race of cannibals. Either one seems to be equally possible here. In one account given by a Billy Steve, who was also a member of Sarah Winnemucca's Pyramid Lake Paiute or Kwi-Wi Te Cah tribe, Numuzoho visits a village, and he approaches from the south. And as for time frame for this story, it's never explicitly stated, but it's sometime between the flood and the last, 1,000 or so years. Basically, it happens at some point during the Holocene period. But as Numuzoho, or this particular one of the cannibals, travels, it's said that he says, "We moho moho moho," and a woman who lives off on her own, away from the village, hears him coming. So she goes to tell the rest of the band, the tribe, and she says, "Hey, the cannibal is coming. I hear him. He's saying, 'We moho moho moho.'" Now, the people of the village are all too busy doing their own thing. Some versions of the story say that they were playing some sort of gambling game. Others just say that they were, working and performing their daily duties, and they just didn't believe her that this guy was coming. So, unable to convince anybody, she goes back to her own camp. She finds either a grain pit or a menstruation hut. It's unclear. It just says that it's a hole in the ground away from everything else. And she just goes in there and she hides. Soon after this, Numuzoho arrives at the village, peeks his head into, the main building where everybody's sort of gathered, congregated, hanging out, and he goes, "Psst, psst, psst, shut your eyes dry," which somehow kills everybody. In this account that I was reading, the interpreter even said that it must have some sort of magical meaning, that it's something that would have made sense to the people who originally recorded the story, but it's lost its meaning through time. It's obscure. However, there is one survivor of this attack, and that is an infant who was at the back of the room taking a nap behind its mom. Now, Numuzoho doesn't even realize that the infant has survived because he doesn't bother to eat any of these people. He just went in and felt like killing an entire village worth of people. So this woman, who is referred to as Old Mother in some of the retellings, she goes and she rescues this sole surviving baby, and she goes off into the wilderness. And her intention here is to go and find a husband, and she had been told about a man who lived on a mountain and had lots of meat, and this was all that was required for him to be desirable. Yeah, don't we all wish that it was as simple as living on a mountain with lots of meat? According to some of the sources, this mountaintop he lived on was Job Peak, east of Fallon, Nevada. Now, the next few plot points vary from version to version, but they are thematically consistent. Basically, what that means is that the characters change slightly, maybe specific bits of dialogue change a little bit, but for the most part, the main beats of the story are the same. The first thing is that while in the wild, she sets up camp, she sets the baby down, and she goes looking for some food. She's trying to figure out how they're going to survive this journey. During this outing, in some way or another, the cannibal discovers her and the child and is diverted away to go eat the baby. Some versions say that she encounters the cannibal and tells him where the baby is. Some versions say that the cannibal hears the baby crying and goes directly to it. Again, changes from version to version. This is actually extremely common with oral legends because the specific storyteller would often, add, subtract, depending on what the story was about and who the audience was. In any case, after the cannibal goes after the child, she takes that opportunity to go and look for a place to hide. And she comes across the home of Beaver, who is alternately identified in certain tellings as just an old grandmother or an old woman who takes her in. This character lives with the cannibal tribe, by the way, but just is not a cannibal herself. She takes the woman from the village that had been attacked by the cannibal in, she hides her from the cannibals, and then, eventually, she sends her on her way. Depending on the version, sometimes we get some more details here. For example, Billy Steves says that the cannibals carried fire in the tips of their fingers, but he doesn't go on to explain what that means. It feels like them being people carrying pistols would make sense, but this story is supposed to take place many, many, many years ago. This is a story that actually, in the end, is about the creation of the Northern Paiute tribes and how they came to be. So this story is at least 500 years in the past, if not much further, so it can't be pistols. In any case, she does eventually make it to the mountain, having been chased by cannibals all along the way, where she meets the man and they begin a short courtship ritual, which, in the Paiute tradition, meant that they would sleep on opposite sides of the hut the first night, and then each night the man would move closer, essentially asking permission, is it okay for me to get closer and closer and closer, until eventually, once the permission has been given for her to sleep next to each other, they consummate the marriage. I'm not sure if that was how the Paiute did things by Sarah Winnemucca's time, but that is how the story goes in this case. The man and the woman then have children. In some accounts, they have two pairs, a boy and a girl in each pair, who become the Paiute and the Pit River. And then in other versions, they have many, many, many children, all of whom become the various Paiute tribes. You may notice a sort of biblical parallel here to the story of Noah's sons and how they each went off and formed their nations. In both versions, however, whether it's two pairs of children or numerous tribes, the children begin to fight one another, so the father figure sends them all away from their home, which is on the Carson Sink, to go and form their own nations, their own tribes, their own bands, off in the world. And this is what creates the Paiute Nation. In one account, recorded by anthropologists Jack and Catherine Fowler, one group was sent to Humboldt Lake where they fought against the Si Teh Cah, who are identified as the Nez Perce. And in this case, they're not annihilated. They're not just, exterminated. They are actually just driven off. I am a little hesitant to draw any direct conclusions from the Fowler material because it seems like what they did was gather a whole bunch of stories and then summarize what they said, rather than giving you each story on its own. I also noticed that they identify a group called the Si Teh Cah and the Si Teh Cah as different tribes, which seems a little odd to me. It seems more likely that these are the name of the same tribe in different dialects of the Northern Paiute language, but I could be wrong about that. In most of the traditional accounts that I was able to find, there are two different tribes here that come out of this. It is the Paiute and it is the Pit River. And there's no specific mention of the Si Teh Cah unless you're identifying them with Beaver's people. Several of the traditional versions recorded by Robert Lowy in 1924 do identify the non-Paiute group as being the one that is sent to Lovelock or Humboldt. And one of Lowy's sources does say that this non-Paiute group was called the Si Teh Cah, and that they were driven to a cave, burned out of the cave, and then that they escaped elsewhere. And since in most accounts, Beaver's tribe is there long before these Si Teh Cah or Si Teh Cah, any of the people sort of identified as who the Paiute fought at Lovelock Cave, it seems unlikely that Beaver's people are the Si Teh Cah. These seem to be two different groups that were mixed into one. Essentially, if Sarah Winnemucca identified Beaver's tribe with these Tule Eaters or Willow Eaters of Lovelock Cave, that could be how the cannibalism worked its way into the Si Teh Cah story, and it could be how Si Teh or Si Teh Cah became associated with man-eaters. Still, the question remains as to how two events which should have been so distinct from one another could become mixed up to the extent that the cannibals ended up in both of them. It was the opinion of John Reed that these stories derive from a time when Paiute were new to the area, and that in all likelihood this story was invented as a way to justify the genocide of whatever people were living in the area before their arrival. Loud and Harrington, on the other hand, came to a very different conclusion. This story never happened at all, and the whole story of Lovelock Cave with the cannibals and the Paiute and the fire is just an attempt to explain and understand a past period, one lost to history not just to us, but to the Paiute as well. But this faces a host of other issues, some of which Loud can't possibly have known about, and which seriously challenge that perspective. You might think that the archaeological record would put an end to the debate and tell us all that we need to know about the story of Lovelock Cave. After all, Loud and Reed can't both be right. The Paiute either knew who was living in that area and brought an end to them, or they didn't know what happened before they got there and created this story in order to explain a missing piece of the area's history. And unfortunately, the evidence somehow manages to support both, and at the same time neither, because Lovelock Cave is something of a temporal enigma. Modern dating practices like radiocarbon dating have been able to tell us that this cave has been used as a burial ground since at least 4,500 years ago, and that it was inhabited consistently from about 3,500 years ago to around 1835. So that's continuous use from about 1500 BC to about 1835 AD. So the Paiute would have known about the cave if they were the ones using it that whole time. But all of the Paiute stories are very clear on a specific detail. The Paiute did not know that cave was there until the events of the story. John Reed, whose account we talked about in part 1, spoke to a lot of Paiute people. He lived amongst them, and he talked to them about their stories. And he came to the conclusion, as an outsider, that it seemed likely that those cannibals were actually there first, and the Paiute were the invaders. And according to what we know, both from the Paiute stories and from the stories of their neighbors, they were warlike, they were aggressive, they were expansionist. So with that in mind, and knowing that history is written by the victors, you can see a version of this story where it may be that the Paiute very much did defeat whoever was living in that cave, and that the Paiute may have been the ones aggressing upon them, and that when you're telling the story of how you committed genocide, it doesn't sound great if it's just over resources, but you can maybe, just maybe justify it if they're irredeemable cannibal people. I mean, think, which story would you rather tell your grandkids? There were other people who lived here, and they weren't really much of a problem, but we killed them all anyway. Or they were kidnapping us and eating us. In fact, they went so far as to dig up our dead and eat them, so we killed all of them to save ourselves. Which story sounds better? Now, of course, I'm not saying that's the case, but I had to present the possibility. It could be that these people were actually cannibals, or it could be that these people were simply inconvenient and this story was invented to explain away a genocide. There's also the detail that these Si Teh Cah, Si Teh Cah, Numa Takata, whatever you want to call them, spoke the Paiute language. Sarah Winnemucca tells us that, as does her brother Natchez. That would suggest that these two groups lived in close proximity long enough to find it necessary or convenient or helpful to learn one another's languages. They were interacting. This would be a very strange detail to invent if you're telling this story knowing it's false. And if this is the case, the Paiute wouldn't have needed a legend to explain who lived there. They would have known them intimately. This presents a significant issue for Loud's argument, because if this were a story designed to explain things that the Paiute simply found in the area, a way to give life to a lost era of their history, then not only would these details have to be completely fabricated, but there would also be a period of disuse evident in the archaeological record. And there isn't. The artifacts from the cave present another issue. They're not all definitively Paiute, and some of them date back really far. The earliest of the mummies found there dated to about 2500 BC. And that's been part of an ongoing archaeological debate, is whether or not there is something known as the Lovelock culture. This term has been used to describe artifacts found that predate the presence of the Paiute in the Nevada area. They may be a distinct pre-Paiute people, or it could be sort of a proto-Paiute people. One way to look at this would be to compare it to England. The Celts were there forever. So when the Anglo-Saxons got there, there were pre-Anglo-Saxon people, and the Anglo-Saxons themselves were sort of proto-English. So the Lovelock culture could be like Celtic culture, pre-Anglo-Saxon, pre-Paiute, or it could be like Anglo-Saxon culture, Proto-English, Proto-Paiute. Within Lovelock Cave itself is a layer of char. Though exact dating is unclear, some of the guano has been dated as early as 4000 BC, which gives us a very wide spectrum of dates. Somewhat related to that, the red hair aspect has been explained as mummification, but the red hair was involved in the story in 1883 or earlier, which predates the excavation by 30 years. But of course, working from a singular report written in 1929 is never a good idea, so I looked at a few more, and one of those was by Louis Knapton and Robert Heiser. And theirs was published in 1970 and kind of looked at some of the excavation and information and analysis that had come from the preceding 50 years. And some of these scientific details were not available to Loudon Harrington. It also clarifies several aspects. A total of 13 mummies were found during this process, as well as baskets, nets, and sandals, and those miners did attempt to give these to the museum, but they wanted money for it, which is understandable, and so they eventually went into private collections. The second part was that very little evidence exists to support the conclusion that this cave had a break in use. Basically, it has been in continuous use since 1500 BC, based on the evidence found there. There was another archaeologist who had suggested that it was abandoned for about 800 years in 900 AD, but that has largely been dismissed. Third is that Loud's excavation was improper and poorly documented, but did result in some valuable information. Importantly, he did manage to extract over 10,000 Native American artifacts from the cave. Loud's problem was that archaeological digs are typically done in square grids. Instead, Loud used large, irregularly shaped lots, and where archaeologists will tell you how deep into the layer they found something, Loud simply said which lot it was found in. His item descriptions, on the other hand, are extremely detailed. The fourth one is in regards to lot number 15, which amongst archaeologists is one of the most famous ones here. It was relatively undisturbed, and therefore they used that as their control portion. This was done in 1924, allowing Mark Harrington to get something of an actual stratification here. And, as we said before, he was a real archaeologist. Lot 15 was broken into levels based on depth. There were 3 sort of periods or phases, and 6 levels. 2 levels to a phase. It was better, but it still wasn't ideal. The layer closest to the surface, which was the later period or later phase, had 2 layers, layer 1 from 0 to 18 inches depth. That one was mostly just ash, rocks, and guano. Layer 2 was at 18 inches to 48 inches depth, and that contained some more interesting stuff. It had grass, stone, a few artifacts, and then it ended in a very hard, flat, packed layer. Essentially, there was a floor to this cave at 48 inches depth. The transitional phase began at layer 3, which was 48 inches to 72 inches of depth, and this is where they started to see some really interesting stuff pop up. It had mostly the same artifacts that were in the second layer, but it had a lot more of them. And this could suggest, between the packed down floor and the way that the artifacts change, that there was an abandonment of the cave around that 48-inch depth level. But again, their methods weren't perfect, and as the cave stands today, it's very hard to research further. Layer 4 was from 72 inches depth to 96 inches depth. Generally, it was the same as Layer 3, though it had been penetrated by several cache pits that were full of objects from the Layer 3 period. One of the finds in this layer was a long, broad shaft with a point at the end. It was believed that this was in fact an atlatl dart, which means that it would predate the use of bows and arrows in the region. Arrowheads, on the other hand, were found in the upper layers. The older phase begins at 96 inches and continues to 120 inches depth, and that one contains a deposit of basketry and other articles. Carbon dating the baskets returned an age of approximately 1218 BC, though this came with the caveat that this could be an undetected cache and that the layer itself could be older. In that case, it would date Layer 4 to 1218 BC, or perhaps Layer 3. What's important about this is that the baskets may not necessarily date the other items found at that layer. The baskets and grassy refuse found at the top of Layer 5 eventually gave way to guano and ash. Of course, amongst that guano were more grassy objects and rushes. Those ashes that I mentioned rested on the white lacustrine deposit that made up the base of the cave. Layer 6 extended from 120 inches to 148 inches of depth, where the floor continued to get lower, and was mostly guano with some rushes, grass, and ashes. In this case, case, the ashes were at the very bottom. Knapton and Heiser also made use of the details and information uncovered since 1912, and these discoveries showed more or less constant use of the cave from 1218 BC all the way up to 1835 AD. There are a few reasons to believe, however, that the cave may have been inhabited before 1218 BC. One of those is that they found aquatic plant material that dated 2740, and due to the distance from the lake at that time, that has to have been brought there by a person. This means that the cave was at the very least used as a temporary shelter a long time before we initially thought. A femur and tibia were also found in the cave 7 feet below the surface, which dated to 1450 BC. Knapton and Heiser suggested that when large-scale inhabitation of the cave occurred around 1300 BC, they collected everything that was already in it and shoved it over towards one of the far walls, which is why you find some stuff that doesn't quite make sense. Additionally, charcoal dating to 2570 BC was found at 60 inches depth, which means that people were using the cave for shelter and making fires in it at least that far back. Then in 2000, and this is why I said Loud couldn't have possibly had access to half this information, is because a lot of it is carbon dating, the skeletons were dated as early as 2500 BC. So it seems likely, based on the available evidence, that the cave was first used by humans as a temporary shelter, then as a grave site, and then finally as a place to live. But you may be asking, what about the cannibals? Well, don't worry, we're back to that. Personally, I feel that Llewellyn Loud was a little bit too quick to dismiss this as a story just meant to explain the past. Cannibals were essential to the Paiute creation story, so a tribe of even just 2,600 of them would likely cause existential dread amongst the Paiutes if they really did believe that there were a group of cannibals. So you can see, if you have a deeply held enough belief, and that if in the past you have the conception that your entire ancestral group was wiped out by these things, you might be willing to commit a genocide. It's not an impossible story, especially if you combine the accounts given. Ione Allen refers to them as the Numa Te Cah, the people eaters, and Sarah Winnemucca's story is very clear. They were given the option to survive if they simply agreed to stop eating people, and they chose to die instead. That means that, as far as the Paiute are aware today, and possibly as far as the Paiute knew back then, there was no changing these people. They were always going to be hunting you, so you might as well get rid of them. And if we look back at the Paiute creation story, they did have very tall cannibals. So accounts generally agree on the manner and the reason for the extermination of these people, but that's actually kind of where my doubts begin. I can easily conceive of a small tribe of distinctive-looking cannibal people occupying the area. What I'm unsure of is who the aggressor actually was. It is possible, as I said, that the cannibalism aspect was invented to excuse the genocide. It's also possible that the extent of their man-eating was entirely exaggerated, and sporadic accounts of 1 or 2 cannibals stirred up these ancient fears of New Muzoho. You know, 1 or 2 occurrences of cannibalism get whispered down the lane, it snowballs, and suddenly you've got rampant cannibals. Due to this culture-wide legend of New Muzoho, everybody panics, and they go and they just kill them all. The idea that their primary diet would have been human flesh, however, seems pretty unlikely to me because that would have required just so much hunting. If they were really surviving primarily off of human meat, you would have legends about this tribe from a lot more places. So, if they really were irredeemable cannibals that would rather die than stop hunting and eating their neighbors, what the Paiute did was actually kind of a rational decision to protect themselves. But on the other hand, the Paiute were known to be warlike against the Klamath and Pitt River, their neighbors. But then there's the interesting aspect that the Washoe, Klamath, and Pitt River are all referred to by names. They're all called tribal names, whereas these cannibals, they're just strange Indians or people eaters. And the Paiute are totally unsure where they came from. There's also the possibility that a lot of this was just lost in the oral tradition, and that the stories of New Muzoho and this cannibal people at Humboldt Lake are connected. Perhaps there's a belief that they are the descendants of New Muzoho's people. As a brief aside, Winnemucca's account may also reference the Donner Party. In another section, it talks about the coming of the white people and how the Paiute old women asked, is it true that they really eat people? And they're told, well, yeah, didn't you hear they ate each other up in the mountains a few years ago? And Winnemucca was born in 1844. The The Donner Party occurred in 1846, so it seems very odd to me that those two are as close together as they are and they wouldn't be connected. Winnemucca's account also contains a brief, unexplained reference to people eaters, or man-eaters, which seems to be in reference to the Umatilla, and at some point they pretended to be joining the side of the Bannock against the United States, only to infiltrate the Bannock camp, kill the Bannock chief, and escape. But at no point does Sarah Winnemucca associate the Umatilla with the man-eaters. It's just that one time where she uses the term man-eater. There's also Sarah's dating of the event as both many hundred years ago and in the time of her third or fifth great-grandfather. That seems a little too recent. It would only go back as far as the late 1500s at the most, but dating overall is a problem with this story. As I eventually came to learn, in the time of my great-grandfathers is sometimes a more metaphorical unit of measurement than I originally perceived it to be. It could literally mean 4 generations ago, but since the Winnemucca's account gave a broad range, it could also refer to a period perceived as just being a very long time ago, and perhaps even from the time that the Paiute first migrated north to the Pyramid Lake area. If that's the case, and if the weapons used were atlatls and spears rather than bows and arrows, this story could go back 2,000 or 3,000 years. One last thing to address about the cave is that 48-inch layer. As you get later than 48 inches of depth, so closer to the surface than 48 inches, there is less material. This could imply that the cave was used as either a permanent or semi-permanent shelter by the Lovelock culture, and then by the Paiute only as a temporary shelter, which would imply that at some point it was abandoned from its use as a shelter. This could well be the result of the war that Winnemucca's people mentioned, and the collection and removal of bodies and debris once that was overtaken by the Paiute. Looking at everything, the story is, based on the available evidence, most likely the recounting of a war from the distant past when the Paiute displaced whoever used to live there, whatever pre-Paiute people were there. It may have been some sort of remnant population of whoever the last culture to be there before the Paiute was. It could have been people escaping somewhere else that ended up on that land. Whatever it is, the true story here is most likely that there was a war between two groups. Now, whether those people were exceptionally tall, whether they had red hair, whether they were cannibals, all of those details are up for grabs, but what we know is that people have been in that cave occupying it since long before the Paiute were distinct, and possibly before the Paiute were even in the area. So as I've thought about this story in the last, year and a half since I initially made these videos, I've come to the conclusion that there probably was some sort of event that they're describing here, that Loud is probably wrong and Reed is probably right to some extent. But the question is, who were these people, and why did the Paiute really go to war against them? They probably weren't giants, but they could have been cannibals. One possibility is that they were performing some kind of ritual cannibalism. Perhaps, she talks about, for example, how they would be pulling people out of the ground. If they didn't have enough meat, they would dig up their dead and eat them. And as I was thinking about something we looked at just a week ago in the Giants of Patagonia video, there were a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but there were some Native American cultures where they would ritually consume their dead, or the dead of their enemies. So it could be the Paiute encountering something they didn't understand, and understanding ritual cannibalism to be real cannibalism. And the whole kidnapping issue, well, we know that not that far to the west from here, you have a lot of stories about mountain tribes that would come down and kidnap wives. They weren't already wives, they would come down and kidnap people and make those people their wives. But you can kind of see how all of these different factors might have swirled together to make a group of people who may have just been slightly different look monstrous. Now, could they have had red hair? Yes. What does that imply? It's impossible to know given the timeline. Because as it stands right now, until we find another site that can be better dated and contains nearly identical artifacts, it's going to be really hard to draw any conclusions about Lovelock. There were suggestions that these red-haired people who were hairier and larger, maybe they were Vikings who came over after the Leif Erikson expedition, or maybe they were from Wales and they came over with the legendary Maddock, who may or may not have actually existed in the first place. I'm getting to that one, that's gonna be a video. I'm also getting to the Vikings thing, we're doing a whole thing right now. But the reason the timeline's important in that regard is that, as unlikely as it already is that these were Europeans, if this story is 2,000 years old, they definitely weren't Europeans. Now, if they were, that opens a whole nother can of worms, but also we probably would have found steel artifacts, and we didn't. So like I said, without a nearly identical site nearby that we can kind of use to make inferences from after using modern archaeological practices to dig it up, it's impossible to say much more about the Si Teh Cah, about Lovelock Cave, and about what the truth of this story is. But the great thing about that is that, at least for the time being, we get to hang on to one of America's great mysteries. And if you'd like to help us talk about more of said great mysteries, you can subscribe to this channel right here, right now on YouTube if you haven't already. You can hit the like button and honestly hit that notification bell, because even though YouTube will not actually notify you, it does tell them you're interested. The best way to get notifications, realistically, is to join our Discord. That is bit.ly/jointhelodge, or you can use the link in the description to do so. Everything gets put up there an hour or two before something goes live, and anytime we do in-person events or something like that, you get the first notice right there. You can also check us out on Patreon, where we have some exclusive content, like our show Liquored Lore, where we get a little silly and talk history. And then we're also posting all of the scripts over there. I've been working my way through it. Part of the reason that there haven't been that many posted yet is that a lot of them are not written in the format you'd be expecting. They are not prose, they are bullet points, and I've got to go through and reorganize them into paragraphs. If you'd like to support us in different ways, there are ways. We came up with some. One of them is our coffee. Mount Pocono Perk. It's from Tableau Roasting Co. It is delicious. I designed it myself. I was a barista for many years. Didn't pick it off a shelf. I picked the beans. I told them what temperature I wanted them roasted at, and Matt Moore gave me exactly what I want, and I drink it every day. If you'd prefer to do something other than drink the lodge, however, and you'd like to, wear our skin, you can do so by going to bunkerbranding.com, navigating to the Lore Lodge section, and purchasing one of the 4 t-shirt designs or 2 hoodie designs we currently have. If you're still here, let me know if you would buy a shirt that says "She shift on my poles till like cataclysm." Let us know in the comments. 100% of proceeds from that shirt will be donated to messaging against Bed Davidson, the guy behind Suspicious Observers, who keeps lying to old people and boomers to get them to pay for his disaster ranch in Colorado. And by all of it will go to messaging, I mean that we will take the money and be mean to him. Now, if you're looking for more Lodge, we have it. We have 2 shows that are collaborations with other creators. Those are History Unhinged, and we work with Stakui, or History of Everything. Stephen Bell is his real name. We work with him on that. He's actually coming up this week as we're shooting this to help us out with next week's video and a bunch of History Unhinged episodes. And that show you can kind of think of as being like Unsubscribe. We start with a topic, and then it's just watching 2 historians and also Thornbury talk about what happened, and it goes off the rails rather quickly, but you learn things. It's stunningly factually accurate for how disorganized it is. If you're looking for something a little bit more on the spiritual side, we do have a show that is a collaboration with Wendigoon called The Weird Bible, and that is what it sounds like. It's Wendigoon, myself, and Thornbury talking about weird stuff from the Bible. We're not trying to preach to you, it's not proselytizing, we just want to talk about it, and it's good stuff. Basically, I'm telling you, it's not a show for Christians, it's not a show for non-Christians, it's a show about Christianity for whoever's interested in watching it. On top of that, we also have my personal channel, where I mostly just stream video games on Friday nights these days with a little wacky crew of characters. That is Aiden Mattis, or youtube.com/ what's the @ symbol called? Yeah. Is it just called the @ symbol? We have names for everything but that? Oh, I hate that. Anyway, youtube.com/ @theAidenMattis, I guess. Friday nights at 6 p.m. usually. Right now we're playing Sons of the Forest, and it's going horribly. We also have our live show, The Lore Lads, which may be going on its own channel. We haven't really decided how we're going to handle that. We're going to poll the group. We're going to ask you guys how you feel. Feel free to comment your thoughts on that, and I hope you didn't hear Aiden belch. It was disgusting. I'm going to whip him after this. I'm getting the paddle. Anyway, The Lore Lads is, for now, on this channel at 7 p.m. on Monday nights, unless it's not, and if it's not, we're going to tell you. And you can also catch that on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, Wednesday morning after it releases. All right, well, that's all the things we have to advertise to you. Also, thank you, Raycon. I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.